From the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University, this is Human Centered. The evidence-based policymaking movement has grown substantially over the past 25 years. Government officials, researchers, and the public are interested in ensuring that policies result in intended outcomes while being an effective use of public and private investments. Since the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2018, we've seen the creation of more and increasingly diverse types of administrative data, greater integration across datasets, and more governments using data in their programs. Notwithstanding this progress, there remain practical, methodological, and economic limitations to evidence-informed policymaking that must be addressed. Today on Human Centered, another episode from our Social Science for a World in Crisis series. This episode, which originally webcast Thursday, November 10th, 2022, is titled Improving Academic Government Collaboration in Evidence-Based Policymaking. And it includes panelists Jake Bowers, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, Fellow in the Office of Evaluation Sciences at the U.S. General Services Administration, a 2018 CASBS Fellow, and a current CASBS Research Affiliate. Carrie Cihak, an Evidence and Impact Officer for King County, Washington. She was a CASBS Fellow in 2017 and also a current CASBS Research Affiliate. Daniel Hopkins, Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, member of the Social and Behavioral Science team during the Obama administration, and works currently with the City of Philadelphia to improve policy and implementation. And lastly, Piyush Tantia, Chief Innovation Officer at Ideas 42, a social enterprise that uses insights from behavioral science to improve lives through better policy and systems design, and also a 2021 CASBS Fellow. Moderating the panel is Ruth Levine, CEO of IDinsight, an analytics and research firm that helps global development leaders design and test policies to support communities. She's a former lead of the Global Development and Population Program at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation and a 2019 CASBS Fellow. Let's listen in as they explore ways in which scholarly researchers and government policymakers can advance their collaborative relationships in service of generating evidence-informed programs that yield more prosperous, equitable, and inclusive communities.
Hello, I'm Ruth Levine, CEO of IDinsight and true believer in the power of data, evidence, and reason to help us all live better in a messy world. I'll be the moderator for today's session. Welcome to the 22nd episode of CASBS's webcast series, Social Science for a World in Crisis. I want to acknowledge and thank the partners for this episode, Evidence in Government and Politics, also known as EGAP, Ideas 42, Sage Publishing, and my own organization, IDinsight. This event is associated with CASBS's Causal Inference for Social Impact Lab, or CECL, and we'll provide a link to the project in the chat box. You've probably read the bios of our wonderful panelists in the event promo, but we'll provide a link to them in the chat box as well. And I'm going to quickly introduce them before we jump into a conversation. Jake Bowers is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and a 2018-2019 CASBS Fellow. He's a fellow in the U.S. Office of Evaluation Sciences, has served as Methods Director for EGAP, and co-founded Research for Impact, which connects academics with practitioners, a perfect participant in today's session. Carrie Cihak leads evidence-informed practice and partnerships for King County, where Seattle is the largest part of King County, but not the only part of King County, as we'll hear. Carrie guides county agencies on community outcomes and impact with a strong focus on advancing racial equity. Carrie is a current research fellow and former fellow at CASBS, and with Jake leads CASBS's CECL. Dan Hopkins is Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. He was a member of the Obama administration's Social and Behavioral Sciences team and has worked with the City of Philadelphia to identify ways that behavioral science can improve policy and policy implementation. And last but not least is Piyush Tantia, Chief Innovation Officer at Ideas 42 and a 2021-22 CASBS Fellow. He was founding executive director of Ideas 42, which is an organization, as many know, that uses insights from behavioral science to find solutions to tough social problems. So here's how we'll proceed. We'll do a few rounds of questions to the panel, and I'm looking forward to hearing from a range of different perspectives, and particularly hearing how the question of academic, policymaker, and practitioner partnerships play out differently at the municipal, county, state, federal, and international levels. I know from earlier conversations that there's a diversity of views on the panel, and so I'm really looking forward to a lively and informative conversation. I'll have the pleasure of asking a few questions and hearing from each of the panelists. And then we'll be able to take a few questions from the audience. So please feel free to submit questions using Zoom's Q&A feature. We'll ask that you keep the questions concise and on point. Given the volume of questions that might come in, we'll select a subset, but then pass the other ones on to the panelists, and they'll be able to respond after the session. So we'll take a few questions from the audience and then close with a kind of lightning round to hear final thoughts from our panelists. Let's jump in. Okay, friends, I want to be inspired by you. I want to hear from each of you about how you define success in this complex arena of evidence to policy and practice. And one quick example of where you've seen or been part of a successful experience. So Jake, let me start with you.
Sure, that's a great question. Quickly, I also have to say that although I'm a part-time federal employee, today I'm speaking as a professor, and not nothing that I say comes from the U.S. federal government. About success, I see a lot of success, and in fact, I think I see success every time a policymaker decides to think about policy change as presenting an opportunity for learning, rather than like as a risk of failure. I think this growth mindset helps policy improve more quickly and more broadly across jurisdictions. An example of this is are all of the null results that we find that we make public. Every time we present a null result and we understand it as an opportunity for change, for brainstorming, for new theory, we're sort of understanding what we're doing as learning to improve, rather than as, risking failure and hiding, sweeping things under the rug. The example I'd say is I'm really proud of the U.S. Office of Evaluation Sciences and 50 null results, or the null results that my collaborators at the Policy Lab at Brown University with the Rhode Island Department of Health published in Nature last year. So it's funny, you might not think I'd say null results and growth mindset as success, but I really find it exhilarating and successful.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. And that broadens our universe of successes significantly if we include null results. Carrie, over to you. What's success to you and what have you been part of?
Yeah, well, I definitely agree with Jake. One of the studies we learned a lot from was a study that had a null result. But when the term success, when I think about that, what I think about is when I see an aha moment light up in a colleague's eyes, and that could be, from understanding, they suddenly understand the difference between an output and an outcome, or they hear the result of an impact study of a program that they've been working on for, 2, 3, 4 years. Or a lot of times having our staff recognize that they themselves are researchers too. I see those aha moments. And sometimes I've had the fortune of participating in kind of a community-wide aha moment. About 7 years ago, King County voters chose to tax themselves to launch an initiative we call Best Starts for Kids, which is our comprehensive early childhood development initiative. And when we built Best Starts for Kids, we took a somewhat different approach than we usually do when we're creating like big packages, big initiatives, which is to really focus on the outcomes, not the individual programmatic inventions, to ground it in science and evidence, and to have it really be driven by equity. And that outcome, evidence, and community-based approach help us build a really strong coalition that was full of aha moments, which was really wonderful. And I'm really happy to report that after 6 years of implementing Best Starts for Kids, King County voters overwhelmingly renewed it at double its level of investment, $800 million, and using evidence to ensure that every child in King County reaches adulthood healthy, happy, safe, and thriving. And that initiative is now, influencing the way we do other things in King County too. So success builds on success.
Wow, thanks for that. I literally got chills when you were talking about that. That was really, really great to hear. Thank you for that moment of real inspiration. Dan, you have operated at the federal level. I have also worked in the U.S. federal government, and I know that finding success can be a challenge. So over to you for your perspective.
Absolutely. And I'm grateful to be here with such a distinguished panel participating in this conversation. I would say that over the course of my work with behavioral science in government, I have broadened my notion of success considerably. So in 2015, when I first started doing this work as part of the White House Social and Behavioral Sciences team, I had a relatively narrow view of success as a completed experiment or another empirical trial that led to a change in policy, a change in how we implemented some government program or business. But as I have done this work longer, I've realized, and this builds on things that Carrie and Jake have already said, that success is not just changing a policy. And indeed, sometimes you want to know that the policy that you already have implemented is working well. Success can often be found in the process, in the learning, in identifying what kinds of outcomes would even let you know if your policy is doing what it's supposed to. And so the very process of sitting down with academics and citizens and policymakers, bringing them together and starting to try to define what is a good outcome? How do we measure it? What are the interventions that we have control over? What are the touch points that we as a city or as a federal government can potentially influence? I have a much broader notion of success, and partly that's valuable given that my initial narrow notion of success, as Carrie and Jake's comments have indicated, might have run up against a lot of results that didn't decisively say that one policy course was better than another. So with respect to some experiences that I have had, the partnerships that we have built here in the city of Philadelphia have really enabled us to respond very, very quickly to some of the most pressing issues here in the city. So within a month of the onset of COVID-19, we were surveying people throughout Philadelphia to try to learn and identify some of the key barriers to keeping our neighbors, our citizens safe. And so I was very proud that our existing collaboration meant that at a moment of real crisis here in the city, our colleagues in the city government didn't need to figure out who to call. We already had an existing relationship, and we already had a network and a survey that we could leverage. We also got to work very, very quickly, and I hope effectively, when COVID-19 changed how many people were voting. Philadelphia is the largest jurisdiction here in Pennsylvania, itself, one of the perennial swing states. And so it was really important that all of our citizens were able to cast meaningful ballots in the 2020 and the 2021 elections. And so we did an ongoing set of projects to reduce the rate of ballots that were cast, so-called naked ballots, where people were casting ballots outside of a secrecy envelope. We did extensive work to try to build people's relationship with the city and leverage that into increased voter turnout. And so we're very proud of all that work.
Wow, really, really interesting. And, your point about the pre-existing relationships really facilitating the opportunities for researchers and evaluators to help support the COVID response really resonates. That was certainly true with IDinsight. The teams that had these existing relationships with either NGOs in the health sector or with governments really were able to step in very, very quickly. So very, very helpful to hear that. And congratulations on the work you did to advance voting as well. probably had some resonance and spill over to Tuesday, this past Tuesday. Piyush, let's hear from you. Would love to hear how you conceptualize success and what you might think of in your own work when you think about success.
Yeah, no, thank you. Great to be here. I'm going to build on what everyone's been saying and really on this relationship point. So we just released our second impact report. We've been in existence about 14 years. And I was struck by some of the numbers. So we total up, what we've done over the last several years. We've worked with 288 different partners across 55 countries. And that's amazing. I mean, that's a lot of relationships and a lot of learning and a lot of people accepting this way of doing things and using evidence. So that's heartening. We've directly impacted 30 million people just from the projects that we've done, the experiments we've run. If those are scaled, right, that reaches an order of magnitude more. And now what we're starting to do is scale up things that work in one place to other places. And that always needs adaptation. So it's not been as easy as just a plug and play. So one of those programs, I love this one. It works on cash transfers in Africa. Around the world, 1 billion people receive just cash assistance from governments. And we've added little behavioral spiffs to the programs where people set a goal for what they want to use the money for, and then they put aside some money in a burlap sack on the spot because they may not have access to a bank account. And these things, this is now scaling across 10 different countries. And the first one that we worked in Madagascar, we saw results like people actually serving more diverse meals and language learning impacts on kids. I mean, it's just amazing. So it's really great to be able to see some of these long-term effects and then be able to take it to other places.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for that. I just want to highlight, across these comments about how success is defined. I think, a few kind of themes have come out: the growth mindset, the stimulating curiosity, aha moments. I love what you said, Carrie, about having the team in government feel like researchers, be researchers themselves, inclusive processes to bring in citizens, and then the relationships that I think everybody has talked about. So really a nice broad kind of conceptualization of success, getting away from maybe that narrow and linear, do an experiment, have it taken up, have it move to scale. So let's turn from the success frame a little bit to the challenges, because of course there are some, and we're all working hard on them. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about your experience with the interface and interactions between researchers and policymakers, or researchers and practitioners. What are the challenges you've seen or experienced, and how have you found that those challenges can be overcome, either in the early project design, implementation, or evaluation and feedback moments? Piyush, maybe we could start with you. I'm sure you've encountered a few challenges, as have we all.
Oh yeah, yeah. Too many to count since the beginning, but we've learned a lot also. And this challenge still comes up sometimes when an academic reaches out to us and say, "Hey, can I, partner with you?" And usually the ask is of the following format: "Well, I have this very specific idea for this very specific intervention that I want to test, and this is how I want to test it. Can you find me someone who's willing to do that?" When we first started Ideas 42, that's what we were doing also. We would sit in a room, we would generate ideas, and then we would go out and try to find somebody who's willing to try that thing out. We quickly realized that while we were able to find people to do this, they would often back out somewhere along the line, or that project wouldn't work out because it wasn't a priority. Right? They were just doing us a favor. They were just testing that thing because we asked, or a famous academic came along and asked. So now what we do is the opposite. We start with the partners and the communities we're working with, and we say, okay, what are you really trying to solve? What is really top of mind for you? And where, which of those issues could we apply social science methods to and leverage the research that's coming out of academia? Then we matchmake the two sides, and those projects work out much, much, much better. Some of them have led to publications in top journals when we've done a three-way partnership with an academic, Ideas 42, and the implementing partners, which are often governments, but not always governments.
Yeah, that kind of moving, in a sense, from supply side of ideas to demand side for solutions and for support for decision making is a key move and not easy to accomplish. Jake, what are your thoughts about this question? What challenges have you found?
Yeah, Piyush really kind of said a lot of what I was also thinking. I mean, we've seen projects not go forward because you can't share data, because you can't look at the data. The data quality, this should be an ID number, but it has the word dog in it. There's unbelievable challenges that we're constantly facing. But actually, trust was what came to my mind as well. I mean, trust in each other as human beings involved in a collaboration. Also, the idea, that the idea is that the results will be useful no matter what. Kind of coming back to my first, idea of growth mindset, which I know is developed for education, but really seems to work here. That we're doing this research not in order to rank you and to say that you're doing a good job or a bad job, right? The research will be helpful regardless. And in fact, the process of the research, as Dan was suggesting, and actually everybody here has suggested, is very useful. However, we've seen trust fail in many ways, especially across sectors. There are lots of reasons why people have stereotypes of each other, right? Classically, the policymaker is really prepared to be spoken down to and to interpret almost anything as if you're being spoken down to. The academic is really prepared to hear ideology or from the person who's in the government. To enter a relationship prepared to hear negative things from somebody else is a bad start. So how do we overcome it? I think institutions help, like, places like Ideas 42, the OES, King County, what Dan is doing. All these places help train people on both sides how to not begin relationships with these possible negative starts, and how to name and talk about incentives. Junior faculty members are desperate to not be fired. They need to publish stuff. It's super important to them, and they need to, and their collaborator has a heart and wants to help them, right? And their collaborator is really worried about being embarrassed by publication of things. And so but the academic also has a heart. So how to figure out how to kind of create these trusting relationships I think has led to successes by these organizations. Because one-on-one, you can just be lucky, that two people get along, and that two organizations can kind of get along. But I think that there's growing knowledge about this. Like the Research for Impact group is already working on this. Adam Levine, my collaborator's writing a book on it. So, and there's institutionalized knowledge in Ideas 42 and all these other places that we're talking about. So that's hopeful. But anyway. That was my response.
Yeah. Really interesting. And I appreciate you sort of highlighting the maybe incentives that are in tension with publishing, and maybe not being quite prepared to be fully transparent about what's working and what's not in the public sector, because as we know, that can put a target on the back of either an elected or an appointed official. Carrie, you're in government. You worked with a lot of academics. Tell us what the challenges are.
Yeah, so I think, a very practical challenge is timelines. Often researchers are working on timelines that are really out of sync with decision making that has to happen in particularly local government. And researchers also want to be really confident about their results, so take the time for peer review and really understand their analysis. And I totally appreciate that. At the same time, I think it's also helpful for academic researchers to understand that policymakers are making decisions all the time with a huge degree of uncertainty. We're really comfortable with uncertainty. And so often understanding the results of a study that's in progress sooner is better than getting a really confident result later. And for policymakers, I think we really have to approach, as we've heard from Jake and Dan and Piyush, we really have to think about evidence building as continuous learning and understand that as more data and analysis occurs and our learning deepens, what we know and how confidently we know it, that naturally changes. And that was really evident, in our learning and our response around COVID-19, for example. And that's then often subject to a lot of criticism. But I really believe that rather than using that change in what we know and that learning, rather than using that to dismiss the science, we should use it to really celebrate our capacity as humans to learn and to adapt. I also think there are, challenges around objectives. Often, policymakers aren't really clear about the question we're asking, and so the answer we get back doesn't match with the decision we're having to make. So we've got to be really clear about, our timelines, our constraints, outcomes we really care about. So for example, we might be more interested in not the average effect, but on the effect of an intervention for a particular population. If we're not clear about that at the outset and engage researchers from the outset, it's really hard to kind of back engineer to get to those results.
Yeah, very, very helpful. Could you say a couple of words about whether you've experienced the kind of tension around the push to publish?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's inherent in so much of our relationships with academic researchers. What we try to do is really create forums within government where we can explore what researchers are finding and what's emerging as they're learning. So we're co-learning together. And then I think that's also really helpful to researchers because we're bringing our knowledge about the context to bear on the kinds of things that they're looking at, right? So for example, if you had a study that showed that offering people a free fare didn't result in them riding transit more, does that mean that does that mean that a free fare is not impacting people's mobility? Or does it mean that we aren't organizing transit in a way that takes people to where they need to go? Those require really two different interpretations and completely different policy responses, right? So it's not just that numeric result that's so important. It's really working together to unpack what that means. And ideally, we want to kind of have that richness of that context in a publication too, so that it informs not just what's happening in our jurisdiction, but what's happening elsewhere.
Yeah, thanks for that. Really, really interesting example. Dan, it sounds like you've had a very deep engagement with the city of Philadelphia and undoubtedly other kinds of partners. What are some of the constraints you've encountered, and if you've overcome them? We'd love to hear about that too.
Absolutely. Here in Philadelphia, I live and work in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is the 6th largest city in the country, but there is no city that's bigger and poorer than Philadelphia. We face high levels of poverty, and that colors both the resources that we have and some of the central challenges that we face. It's also not surprising, since I'm here in Philadelphia, that I'm going to use the metaphor related to eagles. So when baby eagles are born, they spend about 9 or 10 weeks in the nest, and then they make their first flight. And only, unfortunately, about half of them actually successfully make the first flight. The other half don't. And I offer that metaphor, kind of building on what Piyush had said earlier, because many of the projects, the collaborative projects that start off, don't make a successful flight, right? For various reasons, they may not be successful at the end. And from an academic side, if you really need this one study, that can be a challenge. I think one of the advantages to being a more senior researcher is that I can afford to have several projects that don't necessarily go where I anticipate or don't wind up with publication. So I certainly think that academics going into this kind of work have to take a long view, have to take a relationship building view, and a very client-centered view as well to learn what are the questions that the city of Philadelphia needs to answer. I also think that there is a real challenge in that some of the agencies that collect the best data and are the most straightforward to work with may also not be the agencies that have whose questions are the most pressing or in some ways the most in demand from a justice vantage point. When I worked with the federal government, I did a lot of work with the Department of Interior on American Indian facing policies. And one of the challenges is that I could approach with an idea about how to send text messages to increase attendance at Bureau of Indian Affairs or Bureau of Indian Education schools. But if the infrastructure isn't there to send text messages, that idea is going to fall flat. And I have found much more generally that many of the agencies that are hard at work trying to reduce the burdens of poverty work with populations like American Indians, African Americans that have faced systematic and historic disadvantages, is that those agencies are politically under the gun. They are very worried about evidence being used against them. And they also are dealing with a legacy of extensive long-term underfunding. So oftentimes their data collection apparatus just isn't as developed. And so I think that one of the challenges that researchers really need to keep in mind is that the natural process of finding partners who identify outcomes and who can produce a zip file with all the data that you need may sometimes lead us away from the problems that are most pressing from a public policy point of view.
Gosh, that is such a valuable point. Yeah, such a valuable point that the government agencies that we might be able to make the biggest contribution to in concept may have the most complicated kind of enabling or disabling conditions at the outset. Really, really valuable insight. Thanks for that. So, there are different models. You've spoken to some extent about some of them. There are different models for an interaction or an engagement between academics or other researchers and people in the policymaking and practitioner policy implementation world. So, we've seen a rise, maybe a fall as well, of kind of evidence units within government and embedding a research team in government. There are some great examples and some cautionary tales, I think, there. There are organizations like Ideas 42 or JPAL or IPA that do some version of matchmaking between partners. There are a range of different models. So I'd love to hear any reflections about, from your experience or what you've heard from others, what you think the kind of models of partnership are that are most effective. And I know you've raised this a little bit in your remarks so far, but I'd love to hear a little bit more specificity. So let's see, who should I start with here? Dan, maybe you had the last word there, but you stimulated this question. So if you want to go on a little bit more about the models that you've seen work well.
Absolutely. I think that effective models emerge from mutual understanding to an important extent. I think that in addition, one of the things that I have realized, and I really liked that Carrie had given voice to the idea that many of our public servants are also researchers at the same time. And I have found consistently that public servants who work hard on various policies are very curious about the impacts of their policies, very open to learning more about them. So I think that Effective partnerships are going to be long-term. I think that they are going to be, I think that there are a lot of win-wins in the sense that for academics, ultimately publications, knowledge generation, that's one of the goals. But academics so often have interesting ideas and they want to know how they work in the real world. And instead they are often they subject a group of 18 to 23-year-olds to those ideas. Maybe if they're lucky, they'll put them online and get quite random people who are up late at night on Amazon's Mechanical Turk interface willing to do our experiments. And so for academics, the opportunity to see whether these ideas that we've been thinking about and working on for years, whether they work in a real world context, and since so many ideas work in one context but not another, which are the contexts in which they work? I think that's a real win. At the same time, particularly for a resource-constrained city like the city of Philadelphia, I mean, we have great universities here from St. Joe's, Temple, and Drexel, and there's so much knowledge in the city that the city can leverage for free because academics want to serve the city that they live in. They want to bring this knowledge to bear for the public good. And so I think that modern life, very, very fragmented, very, very specialized. And one of the things that I've really appreciated about these partnerships is that we can build long-term mutual understanding. And that is then productive, not just of specific completed studies, but of a culture of learning that goes both ways.
Yeah, Ruth, I might jump in here on Dan's point, if you'll let me.
Sure.
The answer to his last question also stimulated this for me, and I'll just kind of build on what he's saying about bringing, the program staff and researchers together as co-researchers. A third piece of that is really the community themselves, right? And so when I think about building a successful partnership on a evidence building project, I really like to think about those three different entities. So the researcher themselves, that outside expertise. Then we have our program staff who bring a lot of expertise, but community themselves is bringing critical expertise into this conversation. And that lived experience, being closest to the problem and helping co-create the solutions, understanding what's going to work, is really invaluable. And we try to set up a lot of our work so that we've got all three of those kinds of expertise at the table. And we also really want to make sure that everybody around the table really has equal respect for each other in that conversation. And if that respect around the table isn't there, the research project probably isn't going to work out. So we do spend a lot of time trying to build that trust.
Thank you very much for that, Carrie, and for jumping in. And I am putting together a couple of points in my head from these last two interventions. And Dan, I take the point that there's a real opportunity for particularly municipalities and local jurisdictions to develop good relationships with the academic institutions in their midst. I think it can be a hurdle because those academic institutions don't always have fantastic relationships with the communities around them. So I lived in Baltimore for 20 years. I now live in right near Palo Alto. So without naming any names of academic institutions, I can tell you that, my observation is that there's a pretty big divide between the reputation of the universities and the way many in the community kind of feel about whether they have good intentions for the development of the jurisdiction. So I think that, Carrie, your point about the importance of deep engagement with the community really raises the bar on what university-based researchers have to do to make sure that they're really seen as the best actors in the environment. Jake, any thoughts about this?
Sure.
Question? Yeah.
I do. I mean, I think that actually it's really good to talk about models because I think we need diverse models. I mean, we have like the network matchmaking model, right? That's, we've discussed that's super powerful and really effective all around the world, where you have individual academics connected through an institution that allows for some continuity. We have embedded in inside the U.S. federal government type of institutions where I can access data that other people cannot access because I have my ID card, here. And we also have models where a university will decide. The leadership of a university will decide to try to make a connection. So Brown University, together with the governor of Rhode Island, created a policy lab and had the chief of police of Providence attend the policy lab meetings, in order to make that happen. And we sat in the university. Of course, we sat on Zoom, but the idea there was a university decided to do it. My university is working on its own models. Carrie has created her own model, as far as I can tell, that I if I wouldn't mind asking her to describe just a little bit about how, is that okay, Ruth?
Sure.
But those are the models that I've seen work. And Carrie, can you tell us just a little bit about your version?
Yeah, well, I'm not quite sure which version you have in mind, Jake, because I think all these models are so great and we try to, execute on all of them, right? So we have we in our Department of Community and Human Services, we have it, and in public health, and now growing in Metro Transit, we have people who are, PhD trained researchers, and they're fantastic. And we can, they really have all of that context and that knowledge. But I think what you're referring to is simply, King County doing a lot of outreach, trying to be really clear about what questions are our priorities to engage researchers on. And then we've managed to develop some really long-term relationships with a number of different entities around the country. So the Lab for Economic Opportunities at Notre Dame, the Reg Lab at Stanford, we're working with University of California at Irvine. We've actually got some really great connections at UPenn Medical School. And Dan, let's figure out how we can work together too. And, the point was made before, I can't quite remember who was talking about it, but it's that long-term relationship that's so important. So for example, during COVID, we were able to really, work with researchers very quickly in the midst of COVID to kind of understand some of the impacts that we were trying to unpack, which was super, super helpful.
Right. What I saw is that you guys have, instead of having a dedicated team dedicated to evidence, you have embedded connections to evidence throughout the whole government, caring about these relationships. So it's like a network, and without necessarily needing like office space that's dedicated to this, you achieve. Anyway, it's a cool model that I've enjoyed watching. It's
decentralized.
Yeah, decentralized, right? Yeah.
All right, we're gonna have to work on cloning Carrie. I can tell that's the route to success here. Piyush, you have an organization, you founded an organization that's really set up to be this connecting point. Would love to hear a little bit more about that model and what you've learned over the years. You already cited a few things, but would love to hear more.
Yeah, I want to pick up on a lot of threads that we've talked about, which is building long-term relationships, the null results being useful. So all of this, what it leads to is a feature of, I think, across many models that make them successful, which is flexibility and expectations that not everything will work, and that you need to iterate. This is a iterative process. You work over years, you try lots of different things. A few things work, right? It's a portfolio approach. So when we've had our partners, our donors, funders, everyone get that and support that type of model where we can run a portfolio like that, then we see the greatest number of successes coming out of that, actually. and the best relationships working. So our behavioral design teams that we embedded in New York City and in the federal government during the Obama White House, I mean, all of those were funded with no specific, like, oh, you have to work on a project on, healthcare or this or that. There were no silos. It was just pretty flexible. So I think that's pretty important. And then I'll use that to pivot to, a general point about funding that's always bothered me about in this space is somehow there's a lot less funding in this space doing R&D than there is in, say, the physical sciences. Right? But it costs just as much to do these things and try social science interventions in the field and get them right. I mean, billions went into creating the COVID vaccine, but I think the total funding for figuring out how to get people to take it must have been in the tens of millions, maybe. It may even have been only in the single-digit millions. And that's shocking.
Absolutely. I think there are a lot of nods around the room, the virtual room. So let's turn you raised, Piyush, the question of how this work gets funded, whether it's done in a flexible or a more focused way, and by whom and in what amount. So I used to work at the Hewlett Foundation, which continues to support a lot of social science research across various programmatic areas. And I think, always is all foundations are constantly learning and seeking advice about how to do better. So would love to hear from everybody one by one about any advice you have for funders, including both philanthropic and also through public procurements. Jake, any thoughts about what the funding models should look like?
Somewhat. I mean, I was thinking more about, back to my original ideas about how I'd like to see more null results reported. I'd like to see more press releases like the Bowers Foundation found that something didn't work as well as we thought it would work. But we're going to convene a bunch of people to discuss why, and we're going to come up with a new study soon. So stay tuned to our press releases. I don't see enough of that, I think, from any foundation. I see a lot more, look at the impact we're having, something changed because of something we did. And of course, that's great. But as Piyush said, when everybody gets on board with the idea of a portfolio approach, I would like to see more of that, because it's the philanthropic foundations are the risk takers. The governments have way more money and the governments have way more power. But the governments find it trouble to fund the risky stuff. So the philanthropic organizations are super crucial because we have to do the risky stuff in order to find out anything. But it'd be nicer if people said, yes, we will do the risky stuff. Half of everything we fund should surprise us, or something along those lines. And then let's connect it to the government. So that's, obviously I'm on a roll with these kinds of ideas today, but, I figured I would continue.
Yeah. A missionary or an evangelist for null results, overcoming publication bias, overcoming those dreaded funders who are more excited about that kind of linear story. Really great. Dan, you mentioned that in your work broadly and particularly in Philadelphia, that the most, if I heard you right, the most under-resourced public agencies are the ones who maybe can most benefit from the kind of work we're talking about. So do you have thoughts about either how public procurements or private philanthropic and dollars, or maybe even corporate dollars, can be used?
I certainly have thoughts, and I actually expected you to come to me immediately after you said you wouldn't name any Baltimore institutions, but you didn't. I'm not related. The main funder that I often think about is, well, they're legislative bodies, right? Because working with, whether it's the city of Philadelphia or the US federal government, legislative bodies are critical. And one thing that I have increasingly felt in my work with the city of Philadelphia and with the US federal government is the importance of thinking about evidence, thinking about evaluation, not just at the stage of policy implementation, but at the legislative stage, at the stage of policy design. And I've been excited that at the federal level, there's been legislation and a movement in the federal government to do precisely this. So that I think when we are enacting and designing programs from the get-go, that is the time to start to think about how we're going to evaluate them, what data needs to be collected, what kinds of collaborations across agencies are needed for that data to be collected. I mean, so often I have found that the city may want to do an intervention and the federal government is going to know whether it worked, but the data will never be shared back with the city, right? And even within the federal government, it may well be that USDA does an intervention and the Social Security Administration will know if it worked, but there's no mechanism for getting that information back. So I very much think that we need to think about when we're implementing policies and when we're designing policies, when we're legislating, that evaluation needs to be part of the process. And of course, given political incentives, that's a really hard problem because people want to, take credit for the policy rather than take credit for the process that will evaluate the policy down the road. But I still think it's essential.
Yeah, fantastic that you brought that up, the embedding of both the earmarked resources for and the legislative imperative for research and evaluation is really, really an important issue and brings to mind the kind of seminal work of Judy Guerin and others. So I'm really, really glad that you brought that up. Carrie, anything from your perspective on the funding question? And maybe, I don't even know, have you worked with philanthropic funders in Seattle?
Oh, yeah.
There might be a few of them.
Yeah, in Seattle and other places in the country too. Yeah, I have a number of thoughts. I mean, I can't agree more with Jake and Dan on all the points they made. And what I might add, and kind of picking up on Dan's eaglet analogy, one of the things I feel like we really need is the funding that allows us the time to nurture our fledglings. And often funders really want to fund a well-developed proposal. You have to come to them with a well-developed proposal. And there's not enough funding or kind of infrastructure often in academic institutions that gives us the runway to really build that relationship and really think, nurture that little fledgling so that he can fly when he gets out of the nest. So I think that's a really important piece. We've also, I mentioned Best Starts for Kids at the outset, and one of the things that we did in that was actually a set aside for data and evidence. And I would love to see more set asides in both, philanthropic funding for a program as well as public sector funding that, just creates that pocket of money and expectation that we are going to work on evidence building of those interventions. And I think a really important piece of that, and what's been really critical to our success in Best Starts for Kids, is that that data and evaluation set aside was not just about funding to contract with outside entities to, come in and do evaluation with us, but it was also really about how do we build the capacity in our community-based organization partners to do the data and evidence work alongside us. It's not realistic for us to put requirements on these really small organizations to give us your data and participate in these, evidence building projects if we're not really building their capacity to do so. So we put in all kinds of different supports, funding, technical assistance, and many other ways in which we're helping to build that capacity, not only in our government, but in our community, which is really, I can't tell you how rich and exciting that has been.
Well, go ahead. Tell us a little bit about how that was a real tease there.
Yeah, well, I think there's this common perception that we have to put the equity work over here and we have to put the evidence work over here, and kind of never the twain shall meet. And, there are some good reasons for that tension to exist. There are many communities where, research has done more harm than good and has been very extractive. But at the same time, if we approach it in a really pro-equity, anti-racist way and do it with communities are really eager to use their own data. They want to know what's happening in their community. And frankly, it's the communities themselves who have the biggest stake in our success or our failure. It's not a politician, it's not a researcher. The impact is in community. And so, really trying to, it's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy. It's really hard, which is why we don't often try to do it, right? But when we do, it creates so much benefit. Just a really quick example in Best Starts for Kids, just one of the many things we've been doing is these data deep dives with community, where we set these tables. Well, now they're Zoom rooms, but we set these tables where we're all looking at the data together, and community is helping us to interpret that and think about what the issues are and what the solutions are. And so we're not just interpreting data, but we're really, setting the agenda for what we, where public investment goes. So it's so impactful, so meaningful.
Yeah, really helpful to hear. I'm eager, Piyush. I'm putting you on notice. I'm going to turn to you in just a couple of seconds to talk about this as a frontier, opportunity and challenge in the work that I'm imagining you do. I just want to say that I've often wondered how our work and certainly our communication would be different if we envisioned developing work that would yield recommendations for action by the communities that are most affected, rather than, the policy implications or the recommendations for improved implementation. I think sometimes the recommendations might come out like, vote the bastards out, rather than the sort of highly technical recommendations that we might generate for the implementers or the policymakers. Really helpful transition into this discussion about what community engaged research looks like, how it plays out differently in different places. Piyush, I'm imagining that as for IDinsight, this is a frontier area for Ideas 42. Would love to hear how you're thinking about that kind of community level engagement.
Yeah, well, I get to open with a hard question, huh? I think. It is. It's something we've thought about for a long time, actually. And, the way we always did it, of course, we're now questioning and improving upon was, okay, we're going to start with understanding people's context. We'll go into the field, we'll understand what's actually happening, what their lives are like, and then we'll design something. We won't just take some theory and design, so based on that. And then we'll go further, we'll go and test everything we designed to make sure that it actually works for people and it's leading to the outcomes that we think they would. And we still do that. That I feel is still quite helpful. We've added a few things to that, which is more co-design, where we can do it, without overburdening folks in the community. That's always the challenge. These are often busy people with busy lives, and how do you pull them out for a day-long design session? It's kind of hard to do that, and who comes? All of those are tough questions. Some other things we've been doing is expanding our own teams with people who have lived experience and are interested in doing this type of design work. And that's been wonderful. We have a venture studio where we have 7 entrepreneurs building products for the communities that they come from, and the entrepreneurs come with lived experience. And normally folks like this don't get the resources or don't have the privilege to take time off to build a company for 18 months or 2 years. But we were lucky enough to get some funding to support them while they're doing that. And so we're really trying to build up the experience in the team itself as well, to see what happens in the design process. Does that change something?
Yeah.
So, yeah, and this connects back to our funding discussion, where this was only possible to do because we had somebody give us this type of flexible money at a large scale. And it was the Wells Fargo Foundation that is supporting all of that.
Yeah. Well, I think several of you all have focused on the ways in which moving on these frontier areas really does require both flexibility and more funding. So maybe when we're thinking about Piyush's challenge of, well, we don't get, we only get a small fraction of what the physical sciences get. If there were more resources, presumably this would be an area where the work could really be built out. Dan, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about how you've thought about equity. You talked about Philadelphia as being the poorest large city, the largest poor city. I'm not quite sure what the right formulation is.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to these issues because, yes, Philadelphia, there's no city that is bigger and poorer than Philadelphia is. We're the poorest of the 10 largest cities. And I think that I just wanted to, in part, amplify and build on some of Carrie's points, because I think that the question of the relationship between equity and evidence-oriented strategies is really, really important. On the one hand, we have to recognize, and I think we do, that that the use of evidence, the use of data, those are skills that certain people have, and that all too often conversations around evidence can wind up with like men who maybe share my skin complexion, seemingly telling people what to do, or saying the evidence clearly dictates this or that. And I think that that evidence then can be wielded as a form of power, as a tool. And I think that that's really, really important to identify. At the same time, in an era and in a city where we're so rightly worried about questions of equity and inequality, I also think evidence has a real role to play because it can help us build a shared vocabulary. The city of Philadelphia has so many ways that we can use the next taxpayer dollar. There are so many valuable opportunities and projects, and evidence then can give us a language to start to think about how we're going to use scarce resources. And so I think that, and particularly given that the varied backgrounds and languages and cultural backgrounds that people come from, evidence is at once essential, but we also have to recognize that all too often evidence is used by certain groups in order to forestall, to prevent a broader conversation. And so it's that tightrope that we really try to walk, and I think is so important.
Yeah, really, really helpful point. I also, have observed myself, and I think Piyush, you were speaking to this, that the increased and increasingly successful efforts to have a more diverse and inclusive academic community and community and research and evaluation organizations really accelerates the progress here. And so I think we all have to, sort of put all our strength and resources, again, it does often come back to funding, resources in the direction of a diverse and inclusive team doing the research itself. So I'm looking at the questions that have come up from the audience. As you might imagine, it's a pretty smart group, and they're asking nice, tough questions. So one of them that I think would be fun to hear from folks on is whether collaborations and these long-term relationships that we've been talking about as key enablers for evidence uptake and the research process itself. Has that been, in your experience, has that been sort of easier to come by, easier to develop in some sectors versus others? Certainly health is always out in front. So let's just stipulate health is always out in front on these issues, although not always in the direction we might want. Piyush, I think you highlighted the lack of social science related to vaccine uptake. Anybody have a view on sectors?
I can jump in, Ruth.
Yeah.
I've definitely found it's easier to develop research partnerships and interest in some fields than in others. And you mentioned health as an example. There are lots of researchers who want to study health, housing, economic questions. It's been a bit more difficult, which is interesting to me, to find researchers and a lot of interest in like some of our public transit research we're trying to do. And I think it's for a couple of reasons. So one is, I think it's pretty unusual for a transit agency to really try to own health outcomes. And yet that's what we're trying to do here in King County. We don't, obviously our public transit agency can't control community health outcomes, but we can really own our contribution to those. We know transportation is really fundamental to people's ability to get around, to accessing health services, to getting a job, to getting an education, to social connection. And we're really trying to unpack that. But we have some really fantastic relationships, with institutions I mentioned earlier. But there's not always the kind of the level of interest in that research that I see in other areas. So that's been kind of interesting.
Fascinating. There's a researcher, Mahesh Kara at BU, I think, who is doing work, I believe, in Ethiopia and Malawi on this question of what's the relationship between mobility and some key health outcomes, particularly for women. So
you're going to have to put me in touch.
I will. Yeah, absolutely. Other experiences to draw on, or thoughts about the sectoral focus?
Yeah, if I may jump in, what Carrie was saying about transportation triggered a thought, because I was thinking, well, sector as in, different sort of industries or social issues, but I realized where there is a difference is, I think, in systems change type questions or infrastructure type questions like transportation, where it's difficult to run an RCT, or randomized controlled trial. It's hard to experiment and get that quantitative data that we've all been trained to love. And we ourselves have had to be very conscious about pushing ourselves to say, actually, if someone is asking us to solve a problem that's a really important problem, just because we can't run an experiment, we shouldn't say no to that project. Right? We should do the best we can with the information and knowledge that we have. So maybe that's a possible reason, Carrie, why people don't want to work on transportation, because it takes too long or too hard to run experiments.
It's such a great point, Piyush. We need to focus on the biggest problems and solving those, and not on the problems where we conveniently have data or research methods that work, right?
I would say that the biggest problems, and at moments when there are key decisions being made.
Totally.
Yeah, that's definitely, I think there are lots of people who are recognizing that the methods first approach needs to be updated with a decisions first approach. Dan or Jake, any thoughts about the sectoral question?
Just chime in. I think actually there are many great methods to use to draw impact, to do impact evaluations without randomization. So they're not as well known. There's some, what you think of as the best method might depend on where you got your PhD. But even so, they exist. And so there's really active, I mean, I foresee in the next couple of years, we will have better and better guidance and standardization, perhaps, or at least standard practices about how to do this. Anyway, so that we can, it doesn't have to throw up our hands and say, if we don't have an RCT, we can't, engage with alternative arguments and causal inferences. The thing I would mention about where collaborations have really blossomed, in my experience, has been in the context of networks. It hasn't been sector specific, but the EGAP organization, puts people in the room together from USAID and from universities. And over the years of doing that, you become friends, and you call each other and you say, I need some help. And then you begin to collaborate in weak ties or strong ties. The OES does the same kinds of things. I do feel like if you're alone in an agency or in a university, you don't have an opportunity to create the long-term relationships, or it's harder to develop those. So in any case, I have seen great success with these networks as well.
And I would just add briefly, Ruth, if you want to move on, that's fine now.
No, please.
I would just add very briefly that universities have well-developed institutions to study certain problems. So there are schools of education, there are schools of public health, and there are often very dense, long-standing relationships between departments of public health or school districts and the associated parts of the university. But there are some problems that are real problems for, say, cities or for the federal government or for states that don't have a corresponding academic department. There aren't extensive studies of litter, for example. And here in Philadelphia, one of the approaches that we have taken is to be very client-driven. And so we say to the city of Philadelphia, what are areas that you want to learn about that you're not learning about right now? And so, with an economist at Swarthmore, I found myself, and a behavioral scientist at Temple, we found ourselves on the Zero Waste and Litter Task Force here in Philadelphia, focused on litter. And it's not an easy area in which to publish, but it's a critical area that a lot of different communities in Philadelphia say, hey, we need to clean up our streets. Now my family can make fun of me anytime they see any litter that we didn't successfully do our job. But I think that's an example of the way in which there's a lot of existing infrastructure in certain areas, and then tremendous opportunities in some others.
Oh my gosh, that is so great. Has anybody seen the Swedish talking garbage can? Okay, we'll send that around. I think that was an experiment in the litter field. Piyush, do you know about that?
Yeah, I do. And the videos are floating around. I'm forgetting now what they're called. I think it was sponsored by VW. There's also a trash can that makes this cool sound of something falling for many, many feet and then going splat every time you put something in there. So it just makes it fun.
Oh my gosh, so much behavioral insights that could contribute to the litter problem. That's so exciting to hear about. Okay, going back to what the audience wants to hear about rather than what I want to hear about. Well, here's an interesting one. So this is about access to data, which of course is fundamental not only to the work that the researchers who are directly involved are doing, but to the public good that can come from broader access to data. So the point that the audience member wished to make is that large institutions disproportionately have greater access to government data, and that small organizations also need full access to open data to enable fresh ideas for innovation. So taking that as a point of departure, would love to hear any thoughts from some or all of you about the challenge of making data fully available. And we'll just stipulate that funding is one of those problems for data curation and access. Nods around the room. So other than funding, any comments on the issue of data access from any perspective? Jake, anything?
Yeah. Go ahead, Jake. Go ahead, Jake.
I was just going to say that I think that data access is just to reemphasize how important it is if we're going to include the communities in all aspects of our work. There are plenty of people who know how to write computer code and can analyze data, and we should have participation in all aspects. But if those people don't have credentials to access the data, then it's a problem. Or if the data cannot be shared because of privacy concerns, and that's a problem. I'm hopeful. There are efforts afoot. The Sloan Foundation, I think, is funding some of these efforts to try to figure out ways to share data that's in ways that are privacy preserving. Those are, I think, in early days. So I see this is why, it's very difficult this is why we have these models, right? I mean, big universities can make data sharing agreements and can promise that you will analyze health data inside of environments where you cannot copy and paste into the environment, But if you are a small organization with a laptop and some open source software, which is plenty powerful to do the analysis, we don't yet have kind of like easy, secure data environments that we can allow people to access. Although, again, I think people are moving in these directions right now.
Yeah, really helpful observation, and becomes yet more complicated in the international sphere where each country has different regulations and they are dynamic. They're moving fast. Other comments about the data question? Carrie, I think I interrupted you before.
No. Yeah, I mean, I think some of that goes back to some of my earlier comments about really building the capacity in community organizations to use and work with data. I'd also say that this is particularly an issue with respect to our work to advance racial equity. When you get down to very small communities, that, making that data available publicly can very quickly lead to, people being identified. So we need to, and there are many people working on this. I know, like the Census Bureau is working on ways to get down to very fine-grained communities and have data about those communities. And we've actually done some quite innovative work in our Department of Public Health that came out of the COVID, our COVID response. We have a Marshallese community here in King County who was greatly impacted by the pandemic, and we didn't really have great data to work on. So we've got to really solve these problems and solve them quickly, and do it in a way where we're protecting people, but also using data to, address issues. I'll share, and maybe we can share with the audience after. We have a great little video we just produced in King County about why data is so important to us in our communities. So
yeah, cool. I'm sure people would love to see that. And I also think that there's a lot of progress being made around the ways in which values and subjectivity are embedded in bias in data. The racial equity, data equity work that many organizations are now doing is really exciting. Before I wrap up with a lightning round, any other comments on the data question? No? All right. I'm going to now ask for quick responses from each of you to the following question. Given that the work of doing research and pushing for the value of null results, developing these relationships, and seeing action results from the work that you do, given all the challenges that undoubtedly you've talked about some and you undoubtedly experience, what keeps you going? Dan.
I think it partly, all of us have alluded to this, but the opportunity to make a difference, the opportunity to take these ideas, there's a Shakespeare quote about, I've been thinking too much, I need to do. And I think that there is some of that from my end, that the opportunity to actually see these ideas in practice, and also to, I mentioned earlier that, it takes a long time to develop the professional expertise to get to the level of, say, a senior civil servant. And to be able to talk, to realize the deep curiosity that public servants have, and to learn from many of the best practices in government, which have been accumulating over decades, but maybe not filtered into the academy. To me, the novelty and the ability to see whether these research ideas work in real world impactful settings, to me is tremendously motivating.
Great. Piyush, what keeps you going?
Similar. It's the potential. There's so much to do. And then I keep thankfully getting proof points, right? Because we have projects finish and good things happen. And so that keeps me going, or I hear about something someone else has done. And that's always encouraging.
Jake, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that I like to think of myself as a member of a gigantic worldwide team, all working to make the world a better place in the face of all the challenges. So when something is going wrong, I think, well, I'm going to play my role on this amazing worldwide team. And so I love to feel that I'm trying to make a difference when I face the challenges. I also think that it's thrilling to learn both about government, but also to have my scientific theories be challenged by the application itself. So I come away from them thinking, man, we need to go back to the lab. We need some more basic science here. What's the science of federal form filling out? So there's so many new questions coming up that it's also exhilarating in kind of a scientific perspective, in addition to making a difference.
This is a man who just loves those null results.
I do.
Carrie, I've heard a lot about what keeps you going, but would love to hear you sum it up.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely on Team Jake. As a public servant, it's really, I talk about how my richest, best education is not, in the academy, but through the work that we've done with community here in King County. And it really is those communities that keep me motivated, and particularly the communities who we've most marginalized. They deserve our deep commitment to build evidence with them. And my experience is not only that they're eager to do so, but they want to be there with us. And they face as I said before, they face the highest consequences when we don't have that commitment. And so we have to follow through on it.
Really, really wonderful remarks. Thanks to all members of today's panel for this really enriching and inspiring conversation. I'm sure both experienced researchers and the next generation has learned a lot from this conversation. I want to again thank the event's co-sponsors, EGAP, Ideas 42, IDinsight, and Sage Publishing. And a heads up for the audience, the information about social science for a world in crisis, including how to view previous episodes in the series and find out about upcoming episodes, is coming on your screen in just a few seconds. Thanks again to the panel for a great conversation, and to everyone for joining us today.
That was Ruth Levine, Jake Bowers, Carrie Cihak, Daniel Hopkins, and Piyush Tantia. As always, you can follow us online or in your podcast app of choice. And if you're interested in learning more about the Center's people, projects, and rich history, you can visit us at our website at casbs.stanford.edu. Until next time, from everyone at CASBS and the Human Centered team, thanks for listening.